Hello everyone, this is Past Imprinted. I'm your host Lloyd, and welcome to a special spooky season episode. While normally we look at a randomly selected newspaper in a randomly selected year, I decided it might be fun to dig into some spooky tales from newspapers of yesteryear. Now, it wouldn't be Past Imprinted without some random selection, and considering we've got over 100 years worth of papers to look through, I randomly selected 4 different years, then picked out some stories of the supernatural and mysterious from each of them. Since this is our first special episode ever, I'm going to keep it simple and focused on ghost story type items this time. And to give some context as to how these stories appeared in their respective papers, most are presented not necessarily as fiction, but certainly like hearsay instead of straightforward news items. Although that was common in those older papers, they would often print stories that came into their office without any sort of verification, so they could quickly fill up their pages with things that would interest their readers. There are a couple, however, that are published as local news items, not that the paper is endorsing the existence of ghosts, but more reporting on some mysterious or purportedly paranormal event in their city. But that's enough of my commentary. Let's float into our first spooky story of the otherworldly, which comes from the January 22nd, 1879 edition of the Buffalo Weekly Courier in Buffalo, New York. This particular story actually appeared in a few different papers around the country, and they all seem to attribute it to a different source newspaper. The only named person in the story is referred to as Miss Blank, which I've seen a few times in stories like this that are supposedly true, but the author wants to avoid either giving away someone's identity or avoid the hassle of making up a fake name. There's also a subtitle to the article, but it's kind of a spoiler, so I'll simply tell you that this story is called Ghosts in New York. Ghost stories are always in order, and a haunted house in New York will be regarded as a great novelty. But I'm reminded of a story told to me by a well-known and much talked about lady author and lecturer. She is neither a fanatic nor a fool, and the last person in the world to see sights or dream dreams. She had taken the upper floor of a house in 15th Street and furnished it herself. In a few days, she noticed that in a certain part of one of the rooms, a strange, unearthly chill came over her. It was so disagreeable that she shunned the spot. She also frequently had a very distinct feeling that someone was coming up the stairs, and at first rose and opened the door expecting to see a visitor, but finding no one. In the night, between 11 and 12, she was regularly awakened from sleep, as though someone was standing by her bed, and oftentimes as though a hand was on her throat trying to strangle her. She could see no one, and the experience became so disagreeable that she gave up her bed to her maid, a very substantial, matter-of-fact, and courageous person, and took to the lounge where she slept without difficulty. But the poor domestic had a hard time of it. She had experienced the chill and had opened the door hundreds of times to the stranger coming up the stairs. Now she was choked every night, just as though someone was trying to strangle her. One of the lady's friends visited and experienced the chill and also opened the door to the invisible visitor without knowing what the occupants had felt and declared that the place was strange and depressing. A popular newspaper writer, a lady well known in social circles here, called one day and told the occupant of the rooms, who had left her alone a few minutes, that they were haunted, as she had seen the form of a person standing in the very place where the unearthly chill had been felt by several persons. Sickness obliged the lady to leave her apartments for several weeks in charge of her faithful servant. When she returned, she found this woman nervous and emaciated, as though she had been very ill and was still suffering. In reply to her agitated inquiries, the woman told her substantially the following story. "It was near midnight after you left that I woke suddenly out of a sound sleep, and there sat a woman in the rocking chair by the fire, her back toward me, with a full head of dark hair. I thought it was a piece of impertinence in anyone to come up to my room at that time of night and without knocking. Then I remembered that I had fastened the door, but to be certain about it, I slipped out of bed at the foot and tried the door, which I found bolted. Then I got into bed. The woman turned her face toward the door in an anxious way, inclining it as though listening to hear someone coming up the stairs. Then she rose as though she were coming toward the bed. I covered myself with the bedclothes and stood it as long as I could in that way. When I looked out, the room was empty. This strange visitor returned night after night, and some of her doings the domestic was unwilling to repeat. She lost 14 pounds of solid flesh by the experience, and was only too glad to escape out of the place. Some weeks after leaving the home, the lady, who was staying with a friend in New Jersey, was surprised to see her maid coming up the steps of her house in great glee one morning. "I have found out all about it," she exclaimed. "That house is haunted." And then she told of calling on a dressmaker to get some work done, and incidentally mentioning where she had lived. "Did Miss Blank occupy those upper rooms?" she asked. "Did you have no trouble there?" she inquired. On being told that the place was objectionable, she said, "It is strange that no one told Miss Blank that that house is haunted. I took lease of it for 3 years, but was obliged to give it up at a loss of several $100s after a few months. It was haunted, and I had nothing but misfortune there. You know, a woman strangled her husband in that upper chamber several years ago. He had abused her in his drunken fits, and she endured it until she became desperate. One night she waited for his return and choked him to death on the bed, and the poor creature's spirit has haunted those rooms ever since." Miss Blank visited the dressmaker and had a full recital of her experiences in the haunted house, and ascertained upon inquiry that she is a highly respected and trustworthy woman, and Miss Blank regards her former domestic, whom she has known for years, as absolutely truthful and quite free from superstition and nonsense, an unusually plucky and sensible woman. But you should hear Miss Blank tell the story. It would be curious to know how many haunted houses there are within a mile of Union Square or Murray Hill. Our next narrative of the supernatural and mysterious comes to us from the November 11th, 1894 edition of the Cleveland Plain Dealer in Cleveland, Ohio. Now, this edition has almost an entire page devoted to ghost stories by the staff. So I had about a half dozen to choose from, so we might revisit that section in the future, but for now, I'll simply relate to you The Grasp of an Icy Hand. As every well-regulated ghost story should begin with the assumption that it is a narrative of fact, strange as it may seem, that therein lies the wonderful part of the story, I will say in substantiation of this one that the dramatis personae, with the exception of one, rest his honest, big-hearted soul, are still alive, and that 2 of them are too well known to require any proof of the veracity of the story. At the time of this narrative, I was doing the City Hall for a daily paper, and was one day lounging in the office of the Board of Improvements when a man came out of Mayor Gardner's office and said to the mayor's clerk, Charles McNeary, "It's all fixed. The mayor will come investigate it Wednesday night. Chief Schmidt is going along, and you had better come too." The word investigate, then as now, was sufficient to make a City Hall reporter's ears prick up as much as the jangle of gold coins, and I immediately departed to waylay the man outside. He pumped easily, and I was surprised to learn that it was not an investigation of the wrongdoings of some city officer that was to occupy the attention of the mayor and the chief of police, but that they were to attempt to discover the cause of some strange and supernatural demonstrations that were alleged to occur nightly in a, quote, haunted house. I was surprised that the mayor would lend time to such an undertaking, but succeeded in locating the building where the antics of the departed spirits were performed, and resolved to be on hand. The appointed Wednesday, I believe, was the following day, and as midnight is the hour that all self-respecting and legend-regarding ghosts are wont to make their appearance, that was the hour set for the visit. The house was an old brick structure, 2 stories high with a roof sloping toward front and back. It was located on Detroit Road at a short distance beyond the Lakeshore Railroad crossing, and at that time had been deserted for several years. It has since been torn down to make room for the rapid advances of the city onto what, at the time, was a strictly rural district. On Wednesday evening, I sought the deserted house. It needed no pale electric moon and morning wind to make the building ghostly in appearance, but both moon and wind were there. So was the mayor's visitor, and he was waiting outside near the street. The party had not arrived. I had made no mention of the expedition to any of the expected guests, for fear that the knowledge that the expedition would receive newspaper mention might prevent their attending. The reception committee, in the person of the mayor's visitor, was loath to enter the house until strengthened by numbers, but as it was a full hour before the ghost's reception hour, I argued in favor of entering, and my arguments were strengthened by the wind that now did more howling than moaning, and we entered, accompanied by a lantern, which my companion carried. The interior merits little description. It was simply a deserted house, and in most parts similar to a great many other deserted homes, but the rooms were large, the ceilings high, and everything about the interior was suggestive of age. In the room where we located were an old bench, a broken chair, and several boxes. None of these played any particular part in the tragedy that followed, except the bench, and upon this I had once planted myself. My companion built a small but exceedingly cheerful fire in a wide-open grate, and I stretched out upon the bench and concluded that there were some comforts, even about a ghost haunt. After a while, these comforts, or at least my appreciation of them, began to diminish, and I tired of waiting. My companion was by no means a cheerful or pleasant one, and when he stated that he had best go outside to await the arrival of the party, I was not sorry, although to be alone in a haunted house is not a pleasant situation at best. It seemed an interminable wait before the arrival of the adventurous city officials, and I was tired, but forms outside soon led me to believe that they had arrived, and the entire party soon entered. Of the meeting I remember little, for the events that followed quickly after their arrival must have blotted all else from my mind. In a few minutes, the air seemed full of peculiar sounds, and suddenly a figure appeared. It was a regulation female ghost, clad in long white flowing robes. The apparition had a face of strange and ghostly yet striking beauty, but fear was depicted on every feature. As it walked or glided across the room, it gave vent to a heart-sickening screech and turned to look around. Then I saw the huge cut in the throat, from which the blood poured down the white garments. This was the first thing that really impressed me, for the idea of a practical joke had entered my mind with the appearance of the specter. I glanced at Mayor Gardner. His face was ashen white, and I believe there were drops of perspiration on his forehead. Superintendent Schmidt was almost a counterpart of the mayor for expression, while McNary's fists were clenched, and it struck me that he was about to seize the specter when suddenly the shriek was heard again, and it rushed through a door into an adjoining room. Then, almost before the first apparition had vanished, a second appeared, and a horrible one it was. It was a man of fiendish features and wild eyes, and in his hand was grasped a horrible knife from which blood was dropping. It glanced hurriedly around the room and then started for the door through which the first specter had disappeared. As it passed McNary, he struck at it and attempted to seize it, but it paid no heed. I was close to the door, and as it came near me, I struck fair at the head with a huge billy club that I carried on the occasion. My weapon struck thin air, but the specter's cold hand grasped me and seemed to drag me along with ease. "Come, come, come," said the horrible voice. I could not move a limb in defense or retreat. "Come, come." This time, the voice was more natural, and I opened my eyes to see my recent companion standing by me. "Wake up," he said. "I guess they are not coming. It is after 1 o'clock, and I am afraid the ghosts will not appear tonight." The bench was an uncomfortable place to doze, and my neck was nearly broken. The next day, I learned that the mayor and his clerk had never had the slightest intention of going upon the absurd expedition. Our third account of the paranormal, though found in the October 3rd, 1820 edition of the Woodstock Observer from Woodstock, Vermont, actually takes us across the pond to Newgate Prison in London, England. Open from 1188 to 1902, Newgate housed numerous famous and infamous prisoners throughout its existence, such as the pirate William Kidd, poet Oscar Wilde, and Italian adventurer and libertine Giacomo Casanova. But among the convicted highwaymen and thieves, something more perplexing roamed around the corridors of Newgate, something the Observer calls the Newgate Specter. According to the report, on Tuesday night last, a most extraordinary circumstance took place at the prison of Newgate. The following are the particulars. Tuesday night, as usual, several of the unfortunate criminals under the sentence of death were taken to their cells and locked up for the night, and watchmen were stationed in various situations, and the doors were locked, barred, etc. At the hour of nearly 12 o'clock, Mr. Barrett, the head keeper, was in his room when his attention was attracted by the knocking at his door, as if someone was beating it in with a sledgehammer. The door being separated from the cells by 2 large windows, he opened one of them to ascertain what caused the noise, but to his astonishment, he could see no one. On the repetition of the noise, he fearlessly made search, but to no avail. He could not ascertain the source of the knocking. Shortly after, One of the culprits, a bold, courageous man who was convicted for horse stealing and who was in his cell, was driven into fits by the following singular circumstance. He states that while he was in his cell, he beheld a ball of fire pass through the grating of his windows with great force, which struck him with vehemence upon his shoulders. He was much terrified, and after some time it assumed the appearance of a horrid, ghastly human form. The sight depraved him at the moment of his senses and utterance, and he gazed on it until it vanished, as he says, through the keyhole of his cell, and the place appeared to be in flames. About the same time, another specter was seen by one of the watchmen of the prison, and had such an effect upon him that he fainted away. Here it did not stop its progress. A soldier, confined in the next cell to the horse stealer, also saw a specter of the same description, and he was seized with a fit of violent nature in consequence, and continued so for a length of time. He says that he has been in the field of battle, and has frequently slept in the field with the dead, but was never so much frightened in his life. To corroborate the above, another watchman stationed on top of the prison positively asserts that he saw a ball of fire on the staircase about the time represented by the above persons, and made oath of it for the satisfaction of the prison. During this time, tremendous blows were repeated at Mr. Barrett's door, and the horse stealer and soldier were in fits the whole night. The former implores not to be put in the same cell, and says he would rather submit to be doubly ironed and have himself chained to the floor or any other punishment, rather than be put in that cell again. The above circumstance was mentioned to Mr. Cotton the chaplain, who intimated it to Mr. Brown, the prison governor. The following additional particulars form a sequel to these extraordinary circumstances. The convicts thought fit, after having been assured by Mr. Brown that one of the fraternity of prisoners had been amusing himself at their expense, to make some inquiry, and they succeeded in ascertaining that a convict named Hay was the ghost, and the flame of fire and the brimstone. They held a council of war upon the question whether they should try and punish him according to law by bumping, that is, to give him a roughing up. The joke, however, was considered too well performed to be punished, and they wrote a letter to Mr. Brown expressing their regret at having been so weak as to think there could be anything within the grates of Newgate at night but mortality, and very frail mortality too. Hay had apparently taken into his head to try whether 5 men who had not been afraid to commit robberies day or night would be afraid of a sound and the light of a candle at night. There are 5 condemned cells in one passage, in each of which there is a prisoner. At 10 o'clock, when all was dark, Hay entered the passage, knocked at the door of one of the cells, spoke a few words, and thrust a lighted candle through a hole, which is just large enough to admit it, and suddenly withdrew it, to the consternation of the inmate, who cried out, "O Lord, have mercy upon us!" He then did the same to the doors of the other 4, and the exclamations of fright were heard at each. He then stole away, after having uttered a deep groan, which was re-echoed from the cells. So, a terrifying spectre turns out to be nothing but a mischievous prisoner. It's unclear how this Hay managed to roam around the passageways at night, and you'd think that would be more concerning for prison officials, but oh well. I will note, however, that the Observer's story offers no explanation as to the thunderous knocking upon the door of head keeper Barrett. Finally, we head to the year 1908, where we've got a few snippets from different papers, kind of shorter stories or articles, but all highlighting some strange and mysterious happenings in their communities. First up, from the September 26, 1908 edition of the Moncton Times transcript from home of Detroit Velvet Smooth, Moncton, New Brunswick, Canada, we have the eye-catching headline, "Haunted House at Dalhousie. Mysterious lights and noises and strange faces seen at windows." Dalhousie has a new sensation. This time it is a haunted house which is engaging the attention of the town. The scene of the ghostly occurrences is the house now occupied by Jacob Thompson, a short distance from the railway station. The present occupant has had enough of midnight prowlings and mysterious lights and will vacate the place this week. The residents in this vicinity assert that lights have been seen in the unoccupied rooms of the old structure after midnight, and spectral faces have appeared at the windows. Moans as if some person were suffering have been heard by Mrs. Thompson on various occasions, as well as rustling noises as if someone were passing through the rooms. No explanation of the queer occurrences is obtainable, and the Thompsons confess to having had enough of the ghostly lodgers and will seek a habitation where the visitors will be of flesh and blood. Meanwhile, another haunted house gained the attention of authorities in Los Angeles. According to the February 3, 1908 edition of the Los Angeles Herald, the mystery of a haunted, vacant house in Long Beach, which had caused cold and shivery sensations to gallop up and down the spinal columns of the people living in the neighborhood of 17th Street and Magnolia Avenue, was cleared away late the other night by Sergeant Phillips and Patrolman O'Rourke, sent out from headquarters after numerous startling reports had been telephoned in by frightened individuals. "I don't believe in ghosts," said one, "but there are strange lights in the house." "I saw a man and woman standing on their heads in the place," said another. "Heavens," cried Sergeant Phillips, "me to the house. Something mighty mysterious must be doing." When he and O'Rourke got near the house, they too saw mysterious lights. After floundering through a pool of water, they reached the structure and no lights could be seen then. Forcing both front and rear doors, they marched through, throwing their electric searchlights hither and thither. The chimney of the only lamp in the house was ice cold. A rat's nest was found on the top of the folding bed. After wading again through the mire, the officers gazed back at the house. The strange, unexplained light glowed and blinked still. After walking around the house 17 times and sizing up the situation from every viewpoint, it was decided that the light and apparitions were caused by reflections upon the water of a street lamp a block away and persons walking along the street, the reflections being caught in the windows of the house. Mrs. L.A. Mull of 605 Pacific, the owner of the house, said today that she had often been informed of the mysterious sights by persons living near it, and that she had recently asked Chief of Police Williams to investigate. This he did in the daytime, and without reaching any satisfactory conclusion as to the mystery. And finally, we have our pick of the litter when it comes to supernatural anecdotes in the September 27th, 1908 edition of the Baltimore Sun, which contains an entire page titled True Stories of Mental Telepathy and Apparitions, which we will be revisiting in the future. This time, however, I'll share with you a story as told by an officer of the British Merchant Navy titled Specter Steered the Ship. Just 26 years ago, I left Glasgow in a full-rigged ship of the City Line, being a midshipman of the company. We were bound around the Cape of Good Hope to Calcutta. We made a record run to the line in 18 days, and missing the doldrums, got a fair wind from the westward. When in the locality of the De Verde Islands, the captain set the course for the night, leaving the chart on the cabin table, with penciled course for the second officer's guidance. In the middle of the watch, while I was on deck on the opposite side of the roof deck from the officer, the captain called for me and inquired who had tampered with the chart. I replied that I had seen no one go down below through the companionway. He then called the officer and inquired of him. He also denied any knowledge of the same. The captain retired after changing the pencil-marked course again to the correct course. It had been changed to another course by some unknown person. In about an hour, the captain in a rage called the officer down and called the first officer and steward out of their cabins and demanded to know who had been playing the fool with him by tampering with the chart. Nobody knew of any occurrence. Disbelieving and in a passion, he again changed the course to the correct bearings, and warning the officer on watch and myself to keep a sharp lookout, he went to his berth, but lay down with the door of his cabin open, commanding a view of the saloon table with chart in sight. In about 20 minutes, while we were all watching, a man dressed in an ordinary gentleman's black suit came from the fore part of the saloon and, approaching the table, hastily penciled the course back again the third time, heading us out of our course. The captain, dumbfounded at first at a stranger aboard a merchant vessel 3 weeks out of port, said nothing, but recovering himself, sprang out of his bunk, roaring, "Who are you?" The person, pointing to the chart, started toward the companionway, the captain springing after him. In the companionway he vanished. No one ever came on deck where we were waiting to catch him, having seen all and thinking possibly it was a stowaway, though how he could have lived and where hidden himself was incomprehensible. All hands were then called, and a complete search of the ship made, the captain seeming to think that the man must have slipped past us on deck, doubting the possibility of the vanishing, being no believer in spiritual manifestations until then. No trace of anybody was ever found. Then the captain, after conferring with the officers, changed the orders, and we followed the course given by the apparition. The next morning, about 9, we came up to a boatload of people who had taken to the boat from a burning ship. On the boat, approaching the rail, a man cried out, "There is the man I saw in my dream," pointing to the captain. He claimed to have seen the captain and to know that he would be saved by him in a dream the previous night. Yet the man was not dressed like the apparition, nor did he look like him. 4 parties saw this apparition: the second officer, captain, man at the wheel, and myself. This account was logged and can be verified. And with that, we come to the end of our first annual special spooky season episode of Past and Printed. I hope you found the stories as entertaining and interesting as I did. I think it's particularly interesting to me how the attitudes and even popular perception of the paranormal has changed over time. I think these days it would be unthinkable for any ostensibly credible news source to report on a haunted house or a ghost story, even in a tongue-in-cheek manner. Not to mention the police checking out reports of ghosts and apparitions. Although throughout these stories you can see that even in the more superstitious past, most people were at the very least skeptical of the idea of hauntings and specters. So if you enjoyed the episode, please consider subscribing and or leaving a nice review. And if you're looking for your own glimpse into the world of the supernatural, consider visiting Dr. Miller, occult scientist, healer, psychometrist, clairvoyant, and palm reader. He teaches and demonstrates practically all branches of occultism. Readings and treatments daily. Office 88, 11th Street South, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Thank you all so much for listening, and I hope your next news, whether from ghost or human, is all good news.